Here is a poem about deep and tormented and wholehearted zeal for the Lord. It's called Holy Sonnet 14 by John Donne. Batter my heart, three-personed God. For you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. That I may rise and stand, overthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another due, labor to admit you, but to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captived and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. These are the words of a 16th century Englishman, spoken to his God. But it strikes me as reminiscent of a much, much older song to the Lord. O God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and a weary land where there is no water. Thus I have longed to see you in your sanctuary, to see your power and your glory, because your loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall praise you. Who was this passionate and ravished man? King David is a towering figure in Jewish and Christian history. There are more chapters in the Bible written about this one person's story than about anyone else. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel describe David as someone who was incredibly attractive to people. He was almost universally beloved. He was described by none other than the Lord God Almighty as a person after God's own heart. He was called Messiah, Mashiach in the Hebrew. And after David died, the people began to long for another Messiah to come to them from God again. But David was no angel. His story is sordid and passionate, a roller coaster of moral highs and lows. He's one of the most intriguing individuals in our history. But his life breaks some of the stereotypes that we might have about what it looks like to be a person after God's own heart. Today, I would like to suggest to you that one of the defining characteristics of David was not necessarily his perfection, but rather his wholeheartedness. The great Brené Brown writes this in her book called The Gifts of Imperfection. Wholehearted living is about engaging with our lives from a place of worthiness. It means cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up in the morning and think, no matter what gets done and how much is left undone, it is enough. It's going to bed at night thinking, yes, I am imperfect and vulnerable and sometimes afraid, but that doesn't change the truth that I am also brave and worthy of love and belonging. In all of his ups and downs, in his relationships with other people, but most notably in his relationship with his God, David exhibited the kind of heart that Brene Brown describes here. He was vulnerable and sometimes afraid, but he brought his whole self, unreservedly, and he danced before the Lord, both metaphorically and literally. We're introduced to David in the book of 1 Samuel, while Saul is still king over Israel. David is a very young man at this point, while he's serving in the court of Saul. And there, in the court one day, he realizes that nobody among the people is willing to confront the great Goliath, the champion of the Philistines who has been tormenting his people. In chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, we read about this bold young man. His age isn't directly given here, but the evidence points toward him being about 16 years old, if not younger. We read these words. David said to King Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy. He has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "I, your servant, have been keeping my father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and I rescued the sheep. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and I struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the bear and the lion. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, who has rescued me from the paw of the bear and the paw of the lion, will once again rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And of course, you know the story. David actually does it. This brash young boy kills the giant. What an introduction to this personality and this person. But the story doesn't end there. David, it would seem, was not just passionate about defending the honor of the Lord in battle. David was passionate about everything. Immediately after he killed the giant, David is ushered back into the court of King Saul, who is standing there, coincidentally, with his oldest son, Jonathan. And we read this. Now it came about, when David had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul, therefore, took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and he gave it to David along with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went wherever Saul sent him, and he prospered. And Saul set him over all the men of war. These two young men became almost instantly and passionately bonded to each other. And so the father, Saul, could see that David obviously needed to become part of his entourage, part of his own house. When you fast forward that story a few years to the tragic death of Jonathan on the battlefield, we find David again passionately distraught, singing a hymn of mourning, declaring through his tears that Jonathan was his own soul, and loving him had been better than loving any woman. Which is no small statement, since we also read that David would eventually have 300 wives, along with 700 concubines. It's complicated. But really, what isn't complicated about this man? He breaks all the molds, even the mold of a saint. We're told at various points in the early story of David that he was physically beautiful. He was strong. We're told that he was a master of battle and of strategy. We're told that he was a poet and a scholar. that he played musical instruments better than anyone else, reflecting a deep sensitivity of his soul. That everywhere he went, people were entranced by him. David was easy to love. And quite predictably, I suppose, not everyone in this story was all that pleased with the people's love for David, with the military's love for David, with his own son's love for David. Yes, Saul, the first king of Israel, the very one who had taken David under his wing, believing him to be an asset to his reign. This Saul was overtaken by a spirit of jealousy, and he was tormented by it day and night. Paradoxically, in Saul's later years, David was not only the reason for his mental anguish, but David was apparently also the only solution for that anguish. When Saul was plagued by his own unsettled spirit, he would call for David to minister to him and to play his songs. David, who inspired such angst in this king, was also David, whom he needed. The emotional and deeply human dimensions of this narrative are the stuff of legend, but also the stuff of our own hearts, aren't they? Ultimately, the man who had once vowed to support David in all things became the one seeking his downfall, undermining him, grasping and clawing to maintain power over him, and eventually, all pretenses long since discarded, trying to murder him. At this point, which is now decades into David's service, after years of strain between the two, none other than God steps into the story to make a critical judgment between Saul and David. God sends the elderly prophet Samuel to make this pronouncement, as we read in 1 Samuel 13. Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly, for you have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, and now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him now to be the ruler over the people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Thus David becomes king of Israel. The transition was a bloody one, but the decision was final. You know, on the surface, these two men had much in common. They were both larger than life. We're told that they were both physically strong and attractive. They were both proven warriors. They were both passionate and successful in their own way. They had each garnered no small number of followers, but only one of them received the title man after God's own heart. And only one of them would be memorialized for millennia as the very image of what a Messiah could be. Just a couple years ago, in this very decade, the city of Jerusalem celebrated its 3,000th anniversary of being called the City of David. How can it be that one man would become so memorialized? That one man would go down in history as the ideal leader of the people? That one man, by his own life and personality, would in fact define much of the Jewish consciousness and self-understanding even to this day? Whatever the answer is, it can't be that David was a flawless individual. His flaws were in fact many, and they were lived out loud. David had blood on his hands. David committed adultery. David's own family was a mess. Eventually his son rises up and tries to have him killed to take his throne. And David was not blameless in the eyes of the Lord either. For his acts of unfaithfulness, God pronounces that David no longer has the privilege of being the one who would build a temple to Yahweh in Jerusalem. Actions have consequences. And although it was David's truest and deepest desire to create a great monument to the Lord, God's decision was final. It can't be you, David. It'll have to be someone else in another time. Your unfaithfulness in key moments has consequences. David's heart was frequently broken, and he didn't try to hide it. Those hymns that we call psalms that are attributed to him in our scriptures reveal a stunning range of emotion in this person, from contented praise to anguished lament. And yet, through all the drama of this life, Yahweh never removed that name, that recognition that here was a man after God's own heart. In all of his complexity, David was profoundly accepted. The full range of his unabashed humanness was accepted by himself and by his God. So what distinguished David from his predecessor Saul? It certainly wasn't a tally sheet of how many mistakes each man had made. If that was the standard, neither would amount to much. But here is the difference that I read in this story. While Saul spent his days and nights tormented and spinning in his own schemes and dreams, David lived openly and honestly, wholeheartedly. When he loved, no matter who he happened to love. When he danced, and when he cried, he cried. And along that path he made a lot of messes, but he lived in a true way. While Saul was tossing and turning on his bed all night, weaving stories and plotting power, David was the one in the corner playing his harp and projecting into that bedroom, into this world, a sincerity of heart and action. And not everyone could stomach that kind of wholehearted life, but David knew his own acceptability in the eyes of the Lord. And no story speaks to this better, I think, than the encounter between David and Saul's daughter many years later. And this is happening as David is returning back into the city after a great victory. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 6, as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked down from her window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she was filled with contempt for him. When David returned home to bless his own family, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him, and she said in disgust, "How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any vulgar person might do." David retorted to Michal, "I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord, so I celebrate before the Lord. Yes, I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes." Oh, beloved ones, who is God calling you to be in this life? What do you really believe about God's desires for the human life? What, O human, is true nobility in the eyes of the Lord your Maker? If you're not quite sure how to answer that question yet, you may wish to spend some more time this week with that glorious mess called David. Brené Brown, once again, summarizes it well, I think. She says, "Owning our own story wholeheartedly can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of the light. May it be so. Amen.